I've been inspired by Zach's footwear, and it's part of my own patterns, which is what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, to feel a lot more grounded with the right shoes on or no shoes on at all. So when I was greeted at the gate there by a shirtless person, I thought this is definitely TEDxRosebank. And then when the host gets up with no shoes on, I'm like, this is my kind of event. So what my bio doesn't mention, gee, it makes me sound good, doesn't it? That's really amazing. What it doesn't mention is that 10 years ago, when I was really in the thick my life as a Triple J broadcaster, was also that I had a lot of very strong negative patterns that went along with that life. The life didn't propagate those patterns. The patterns pre-existed the career, but what the career did was actually enable me a space where all of those naughty patterns were allowed and encouraged to exist. So 10 years ago, the idea of being free from patterns and having this really positive relationship with negative patterns was as alien to me as early bedtimes and free mornings. But over the last decade, this idea of dissolving our patterns that cause harm have become my life. I did not intend for that to happen, but I did take an enormous lateral step 10 years ago. It wasn't small. I was doing all that I was doing in the music industry. I was drinking, I was smoking, I was doing all of the other things that it's not kosher to talk about in such a public forum. And then I decided that I needed to leave those things behind. So I changed my career. I became a yoga therapist, very much seemingly in an opposite direction, but not really. I moved from where I was in Sydney and I came up to the Northern Rivers. And then I also changed my name. I needed to really observe what is this idea that we have around our identity that gets us snagged in our negative patterns. Making all of those rather large changes, which is not what I'm suggesting today to necessarily do, gave me an incredible insight to how stuck we get on the patterns that we come to believe define us. We actually wrap up our patterns of behaviour in our idea of self-identity, and that's where we get stuck. Everything is always changing. This is a scientific fact. Everything is always changing. Change is not difficult. It is, in fact, impossible to avoid. So how then, as human beings, are we constantly getting snagged? Patterns are created by impressions from the past. Patterns are incredibly important. They allow us to survive. They allow us to do an unquantifiable amount of things in any given moment with very little cognitive energy being expended. We learn how to do things on autopilot. That's the good news. The bad news is that all of that also applies to our bad habits. Who here has at least one bad habit? If you didn't put your hand up, perhaps I should ask your partner or a loved one and they can put their hand up on your behalf. Of course, we all have things. We all have things that to varying degrees cause us. When I started this journey to look at the dissolving of patterns, I was very much in the addiction recovery space. I don't even like that terminology, this idea of recovery. We're simply transitioning. We are always transitioning. Impermanence is inescapable. What started to happen for me, though, as I went deeper and deeper into this world of assisting people to go from one place here of great sufferance to even just a little less, which makes a grand difference, is that it doesn't matter what the negative pattern is. It does not matter. I loathe the word addiction. Addiction is separatist. It suggests that over there's certain people who do certain things that we frown upon. We don't like that, so we relegate them to this category of being addicts or having addiction. The Oxford Dictionary defines addiction as being able to stop doing or using something as a habit, even if it causes harm. I don't think any of us can escape that definition. Almost all of us put our hands up to having a bad habit. That is the definition of a bad habit. There is no us and them. It is only a sliding scale. What happens when we use words such as addiction or addicts and we segregate this idea that certain people their patterns are bad enough that they get their own category is that it disempowers those people who deserve to do the work with as much support and non-judgment as anybody else. What it does for the rest of us is that it disassociates and disconnects us from our own negative patterns. Oh, I'm not that bad. I'm not as bad as that. So then what happens with our own bad habits is that we don't really do much to move forward or progress from those. One of my favourite expressions that I relate back to the work that I do in dissolving patterns is a quote by George Lucas, that we are all living in cages with the door wide open. This is what our patterns do. When we weave them into our idea of self-identity, this is how I do things. The other good news is that the vast majority of patterns are positive. As I said before, they allow us to do an unquantifiable amount of things in any given moment. What happens when we do something over and over again is that this sends a message to the brain. It says, brain, this is what we do, this is our life, now get on with it and make it cost-effective my time. So then the brain chunks behaviours together to form a singular action. I'm able to brush my teeth, eat my breakfast, stand up here and move my hands whilst talking at the same time, drive my car without having to constantly relearn those things over and over again. What it does is it creates the autopilot so I can get on with my life. But somewhere along our life journey, something's happened that's created an impression, an experience in our own timeline, that's created an experience or an impression that's led to a pattern that propagates harm. It might have even been a pattern that began as a necessary and positive pattern. But because it's an impression that's created from the past, as we move to the present and everything is always changing, a good pattern can simply become misaligned and is therefore no longer necessary and can then begin to propagate harm. So as an example, my husband and I are both foster carers, and if you get a child or you see a child who has grown up in a space or is growing up in a space of neglect where food is scarce, they will create this very intelligent, positive pattern. The whole situation is not positive, but the pattern that they create is, which is when food becomes available, they will have some and they will hide the rest. This is intelligent patterning based on survival. They might even hide more in order to feed their siblings. This is very intelligent and necessary patterning. Then though, when that child grows up, it's so ingrained in them that even in situations where it's no longer necessary, where food might even be abundant, that pattern is still happening. They might not any longer be stuffing that food underneath the mattress or into their drawers or behind the back of the couch. They might be putting it in here. And from there, that pattern that once helped them to survive becomes an eating disorder. This is a very linear example. Patterns don't normally happen in such a linear way. I'm just giving a very obvious linear example for a case of study. But a pattern, a negative pattern, can look like anything based on the immeasurable qualities of that particular individual and of the particular circumstance that created the impression. In this work of moving from a pattern that propagates harm toward liberation, we can have no judgment. Why? Because this is actually the neural processing of the brain. It's nothing to judge others about. This work is for every single one of us. But then how do we do that? With the vast majority of our patterns being invisible, where do we even begin? If so many of our patterns are on autopilot, how can we even tell what's good and what's bad when they're no longer invisible? When they start to make us suffer, even just little sufferances accumulate. I've got a particular student who is absolutely obsessed with herbal tea, and if you got in the way of one of her 8 necessary cups that she has in that day, she might scratch your face off. It seems like a harmless thing, but we have to remember that everything is relative and nothing is absolute. patterns are custom made, highly individualized. So how do we know that a pattern is good or bad? Some are obvious, yes, but most are not. They begin to make us suffer. Or they begin to make those around us suffer, so that when we can't see what's a sufferance for ourselves or a negative pattern, we'll have reflected back to us through our relationships, through the people we care about. So they become the mirror. It starts to affect our positive, close relationships. Say somebody grows up on a cattle farm. They've eaten beef their whole life. It's not something that they think anything about. It is so deeply ingrained. But then at some point through their life, something starts to become a little bothersome about it. There's no rhyme or reason necessarily. They might have had a lot of filters in to send a new message about what might be a different way of eating for them. They start to feel not as okay as they once did. When that happens for the individual, that's a sign that perhaps we need to start looking at what was once a totally fine pattern that's transitioned over to something that's not sitting so well with us anymore. So then when we recognize something, how then do we get out? Patterns exist in 3 layers of the constitution: our physical body, physiological, so the functions of our body, and of course psychological. It's part of a neural process that helps with our survival. We have to work with the physical body. Good routines around how we shift the awareness of the mind to the awareness of the body. Our physiological body, we can just focus on improving the state of our own respiration. If you just take a moment right now to just sit a little further forward on your seat and take your feet to the floor. If you feel safe and comfortable in this space, you might even like to close your eyes. If not, just keep them open. You might have a pattern that doesn't make you feel safe to have your eyes closed in a public setting. You just keep your eyes down. And just simply take a moment to take a good round of breath. The breath doesn't have to be in any way special. You can open your eyes in your own time. But the awareness alone to your breathing will intensify its quality. There's a consciousness then that comes into the action, and our body wants to serve us. So how do we relate this back to our patterns at the psychological level? There is no moment in our life that is not in action. No moment in life where we are not in action. Sleep is one of the most important actions, so don't mistake sleep for inaction. So then the sum total of all of the actions is what equals our life. The sum total of all of our actions is what equals our life. So as frequently as we possibly can, we bring consciousness to the moment. Then when we stand in a moment of an action that we ourselves are deciding to take, we can decide if in that moment of action we're going to move towards suffering or we're going to move away. So the first step is that we need to look. And then the second step is that we need to bring a greater quality to the action. And if we recognise that it's around a very ingrained pattern, we simply need to do something different. It doesn't matter what it is. Just do something different than you normally would. And keep doing that over and over again. What negative patterns do is that they disrupt the surface of the mind once they start to create suffering, because there is no greater motivation than suffering, right? That's when we do something. Generally not when we're just cruising along having a wonderful time. But when we suffer is when we take action or change. So our negative patterns, what they do is they disrupt the surface of the mind through this suffering. And what they then do is they create something tangible to grab onto. Because our minds are so vast, we can't just sit back and observe the entirety of our mind. But what a negative pattern does is that it gives us something to grab onto. to follow down and down and down into our own mind. And along the way, we get a chance to see what is wrapped up in that pattern. Connection, disconnection, loss, love, self-worth, survival. So we start to get to know ourselves better through the presentation of our negative patterns. And even if we just move from here to here, or here to here, we are going to be improving the quality of our life. And if we do that action after action, quality action one after another, that equals a quality life. So just remember when you're doing your work in relation to this, which is relative to all of us, that it is very simple. But also remembering that there's nothing so simple that the mind cannot locate. All of our negative patterns come down to one or a combination of just 4 things. I-ness, that which separates you from me, my me and mine mentality. I want. This is how I want things to be, or I don't want. Desire, I had a positive experience in the past, and now I want to recreate that over and over and over again. I had an experience in the past that I didn't like, and now I will do everything to avoid that. And underneath almost all of it is fear. The process of doing this work is only about the individual. Just looking at ourselves, not passing judgment or aspersions on the work of others. Of course, we stand for right action, but the most effective way to do that is how we're working on our own negative patterns. Most importantly, a burning desire to come out of problems. It does take a discipline, and it's essential that there's joy in the discipline and discipline in your joy. Thank you so much, everybody.